We are online.
Okay. Greetings to everyone joining to this session. In this session, we have Professor Malcom SAWYER, Emeritus Professor of Economics from University of Leeds. And I'm particularly delighted to chair this session because he was my lecturer when I was studying for my master's at University of York many years ago. And since then, we have never met, unfortunately, but it's a beautiful coincidence to be able to chair Professor Malcom SAWYER's session today. Of course, those of you familiar with Professor SAWYER's work as critical studies in macroeconomics mainly. His contribution in particular in the areas of post-Keynesian and Kalekian macroeconomics is very much important to recall. But also in recent years, the financialization related studies, as he ran a large project as well funded by the European Union on the financialization, economic, society, and sustainable development. But also focusing on fiscal policy, as well as the questions and the issues around full employment has been an important part of his research and discourse. Macroeconomics, again, extending into European monetary policies and single currency related studies. He contributed to teaching and administration in many important institutions, mainly in the UK. And as I mentioned, he was my lecturer at York University, but from York he moved to Leeds, and currently he's an emeritus professor of economics at Leeds University Business School. And we are delighted to host you today, Professor SAWYER. And the topic today is Professor SAWYER is covering is on the fiscal and monetary authorities in the pursuit of environmental sustainability. Of course, the sustainability debate is an important part, and how policy is perceived by governments in the form of fiscal and monetary authorities have become an important debate in terms of the impact, the environmental impact that they are creating. At the end of the day, most of the governments in the world have signed to SDGs developed by United Nations. And therefore, one way or another, we are hoping to see some positive consequences in relation to environmental sustainability through fiscal and monetary policies. But whether that's the case, a critical take-up from Professor SAWYER. Again, I'm really delighted to chair this session, and it's all platform, or rather than screen, is all yours, Professor SAWYER.
Thank you very much indeed. And nice to see you again after some 30-something years. I hope I'm sharing my screen.
Yes, we can follow that. Yes, it is there.
Good. Okay. I'm going to be indicated looking at environmental sustainability and some of the possible roles of fiscal and monetary authorities. And the main emphasis will be on the monetary rather than the fiscal. Mm-hmm. So I want you to ask really, what can fiscal and monetary policies contribute to what I call an economic and social strategy in pursuit of environmental sustainability, addressing climate change and so forth. My approach to this is to look at it in terms of the need for an overall economic and social strategy. Some have put forward what they've called a Green New Deal, or a Green Deal in the case of the European Union, which is a sort of an overarching strategy, which I would like to see expanded somewhat, but beyond the Green New Deal. But it's within an overall framework, and so within that framework, what would be the responsibilities and contributions of fiscal and monetary policies, if any? I want to argue that monetary policies can be supportive, but not particularly crucial. And fiscal policies similarly. So in terms of fiscal policies, let me just put that on one side fairly quickly. I think the first requirement is what I call a socially responsible budget position. That is, that the fiscal policy should seek to arrange the budget position, the fiscal policy in what I would regard as a socially responsible way, which is to seek to maintain a high level of employment, rather than one which is deemed to be fiscally responsible. And by that I mean to avoid one which is seeking to balance the budget over some time horizon, or which is concerned with the overall level of debt, and particularly with reducing the level of public debt. Because I think in the context of environmental sustainability, to direct the fiscal policy in that direction, and in order and seeking, for example, that the form of public expenditure and the form of investment, and also the general contribution of fiscal policy to that sustainability issue is much more important than seeking to balance budgets and so forth. And perhaps just very simply, I think the main requirement in terms of public expenditure is that public investment and the tax system seem to be supportive of sustainability. So that's the usual sorts of arguments that public investment should be in the direction of environmentally friendly infrastructure and taking on board all the requirements of environmental sustainability. And certainly the tax system is used to guide expenditures in environmentally friendly directions, may involve various forms of carbon taxation, but essentially the focus should be on what are the structures of public expenditure and the tax system, rather than being concerned with what is the overall balance between them, and that overall balance should be aimed towards issues of full employment. I think one also should recognize, in the context of climate change, the difficulties which will then come about partly in terms of the operation of fiscal policy, but also the operations of monetary policy. Because climate change and the policies towards them involve large structural changes. It's going to involve the movement of employment between different sectors of the economy, going to be involved obviously investment in environmentally friendly and away from environmentally harmful activities. So there's going to be quite a lot of structural change. So calculating how full employment will be achieved, or calculating what is the capacity of the economy in order to gear, or if one is gearing fiscal policy or monetary policy in that direction, are going to be even more difficult than they have been in the past. So the guidance on fiscal policy, and indeed on monetary policy, will become, I think, are becoming much more complex. And in some respects, we've seen this in the case of the COVID pandemic, that trying to now think in terms of what should be the appropriate level of fiscal policy, in the context where, as has been recently, certain sectors of the economy have been effectively closed down, that there's been a shift in the structure of working and so on. So what would actually constitute full employment, or how far it can be achievable in those circumstances, is brought to the fore. Now, I think the other aspect of our macroeconomic policies in general, fiscal and monetary policy, is that there has to be, as being developed, clear guidance, clear government indications of those activities which would be sort of regarded as green or environmentally friendly, and those which would be deemed brown or environmentally unfriendly. So there is a need for effectively an overarching taxonomy of those activities which are going to be deemed as green and those which are brown, and corresponding to that, those forms of finance which could be regarded as green finance, and those which are brown finance, and then in the area of public investment also to guide the activities of the public investment in terms of issues of sustainability. And I think in a number of respects, it is easy to talk about something being green or not green, but the actual formulation of that is, I think, extraordinarily difficult. And I would want just to raise very briefly just two sorts of issues. I think the first one is who should be drawing up the taxonomy. Now, we've seen a number of taxonomies being developed, some by government, some by financial institutions and others. And I think what is important here, and I particularly would argue this in the context of monetary policy, is that the taxonomy is the responsibility of a democratic government as a part of an overall environmental strategy and the funding of investment. So I would argue against central banks and others drawing up their own taxonomy, unless that taxonomy is coordinated with that which is drawn up by the government. There could be a taxonomy of financial instruments which has to go into the details of how that is going to operate in the context of an overall taxonomy of what is green and what is not. Now, I think it's fairly straightforward what are the difficulties of this and how far it can actually go in terms of agreeing on what is going to be green and what is not. And there are obvious issues about that if a company is raising money, then or raising funds, then they can be using that for a variety of purposes and not necessarily going to be directed towards a specific project, even though they put forward the project as being green and then trying to fund it. But also, and I think perhaps more significantly, is how do you take full account of what might be called the greenness of the project? What does it say about the inputs which are being used in that production process, and have they been produced in an environmentally friendly or environmentally damaging way? But I think also we need to take into account that the products which are produced are going to be sold to consumers, and the consumers are going to use them in particular ways. They're going to use them for different lifetimes. They're going to be subject to all sorts of recycling. So how far one can go in terms of really settling on what is going to be green. I have some sort of issues over that. I'm sure there are others who are much more expert in this to be able to say. But I think also it's a matter of how broadly one looks at this in terms of what is green or not, or what is environmentally friendly or not. You know, the tendency, I suppose, has been to look in terms of carbon use and the effects in that sort of direction, whereas there's a much broader range, obviously, of issues concerning with issues of, for example, biodiversity, the extent to which nature is being used in the production processes and economizing on those. As I indicate here, that I think one of the significant issues here is who should take the decisions on the taxonomy, who should draw them up, and how far that should be in line with general government policies, and then also the enforcement of that taxonomy. Now, my particular focus is going to be on monetary policy, and I particularly want to consider monetary policy in a very broad sense. So I mean, here in a sense, I'm thinking of monetary policy as being anything which is any policy which is operated by the central bank, whether one regards it as directly affecting the volume of money or interest rates, but or policies which are or could be within the operational remit of the central bank. Now, we've over many years had these discussions about objectives and targets, or instruments and targets, and how they should be aligned with one another. So here I want to look at firstly at the issue of what should be the objective or target which should be assigned to the central bank. But further, there are aspects, I think, of overall economic and social policies which are significantly impacted by central bank decisions. And I think there the question is how far these can or ought to be taken into account by the central bank in their decision making. So it's not so much a matter of what are the objectives assigned to the central bank, although it's part of that, but what other factors should be taken into account when the central bank is making decisions. Now, I think I would use inequality, however that is perceived as inequality of income or inequality of wealth, as an illustration of this. There's been quite a lot of debate about whether monetary policy, whether it's interest rates or the operation of quantitative easing and so on, may have effects upon inequality. Again, whether it's wealth inequality, as much of the debate in terms of quantitative easing, or the effects upon distribution between borrowers and lenders in the case of interest rates. But can these effects be taken into account when the monetary policy decisions are made? And whilst we may recognise that there are effects upon inequality, are these can these in any way be taken into account when decisions are being made? And should these in any sense be seen as or inequality or reduction of inequality in a sense be seen as part of the mandate of the central bank? And of course, in this particular context as well, there are many uncertainties of the effects of monetary policy on inequality. On the one side, we have different dimensions, different instruments of monetary policy. On the other, we have different views about inequality, views about which inequality we're looking at, in income or wealth, and so forth. And whilst those have been subjects of debates, there are considerable uncertainties about what those effects would be. So I think on that basis, difficult to take into account, or difficult to think in terms of reduction of inequality as being in any sense an objective of the central bank. But then have to consider whether there are ways in which the effects of monetary policy, or potential effects of monetary policy on inequality, could be taken into account in terms of the policies to be settled upon. Now, I think in the context of environmental sustainability, the issue there may be a little bit simpler, easier than it was in the case of inequality, because I think there is a ways in which one could think of the central bank not so much as targeting environmental sustainability, but there are ways in which its policy can take into account effects upon environmental issues and lay down ways in which that can be taken into account. Now, in the present time, or over the last, say, 10 years, there have been certain moves in the direction of the resetting of objectives of central banks. We went through an era when inflation targeting was the major form of monetary policy, set the objective for the central bank in terms of the control of inflation. It established what the instruments would be, interest rate, and that, of course, was to be typically operated by an independent central bank, or a central bank which took its policy, took its decisions, in a sense, independent of government. So now we have seen some moves in the direction of incorporating objectives such as financial stability into the objectives of the central bank, and some moves, a recent one announced in the UK, to incorporate issues of environmental sustainability, if not into the objectives, at least into the concerns of the central bank. So if we look at the European Central Bank's objectives, which are to generally support the economic policies of the European Union with a view to contributing to the achievement of those objectives, at one level it would be relatively straightforward as to interpret those objectives as the support of economic policies being the support of policies which are addressing the climate emergency and environmental degradation. But of course, at the moment, the ECB objectives are, in terms of supporting those general economic policies, are placed secondary to the control of inflation. But what I would be arguing for, although it's going to be enormously difficult to get this changed in the context of the European Central Bank, but that the objectives of a central bank should be much more cast in terms of the support of the general economic policies of the government, and with particular mention of issues of financial stability and the environmental sustainability. Now, I think also we have to raise the question of what monetary policy can achieve. Clearly, in the last 20 to 30 years, it has often been, at least in principle, limited to inflation control, and done so on the basis that money and monetary policy do not affect economic activity other than in the short run. So it was a limited objective, in a sense, of inflation control, but also limited in terms of what it was deemed the monetary policy could itself influence. So we have to, I think, ask in terms of the objectives of the central bank, or that what objectives should be set for the central bank, is what can monetary policy contribute, how, and that raises, I think, issues about the financing of government expenditure and the coordination with fiscal policy. We have to look at its a combination of open market operations and more generally its financial asset purchases. Clearly, over the last 10 to 12 years, at certain stages, the central bank has been major purchasers of financial assets, initially very much focused on government bonds, and then to some extent moving in the direction of private bonds as part of the operations of quantitative easing. There are also the issues of financial stability, which just came to the fore after the global financial crisis, but also in terms of the way financial stability has moved to being a responsibility of the central bank. And I want to indicate later on that the relationship between, or possible relationship between issues of financial stability and environmental sustainability. Now, as we can see, or as we know, a centerpiece of central bank policy has been this inflation targeting, but with decisions made by the independent central bank. Now, one line of argument I want to pursue here is, on the one side, what would deem to be the purpose of an independent central bank, and on the other, can that any longer be maintained if the objectives of the central bank, or the concerns and issues of the central bank, are widened much beyond inflation targeting, or beyond inflation targeting and financial stability. So if we, for the moment, just leave aside whether leave aside the issue about whether interest rate policies is an effective instrument for inflation targeting, which I have some doubts on, was the independence of the central bank and its independence in terms of decision making, particularly over interest rates, was justified on the grounds of, as it were, credibility. There was these arguments that a central bank would be deemed to be more concerned with inflation control than a government would be, so that if the central bank were changing interest rates in a particular direction, markets and others would believe that the central bank was doing that with good reason, rather than it was consistent with the inflation targeting, rather than being designed, for example, to reflate the economy and so forth. So these sort of credibility arguments in terms of the independence of the central bank. Now, if we move to other areas of policy, then it seems to me that these sort of credibility arguments, even if they were valid in the context of inflation targeting, don't have the same sort of power. Because indeed, one would want the central bank to be concerned with over the general range of government policies and the consistency of their actions with those policies. Now, we also been long arguments about the effects of the independence of central bank, which appears to preclude any effective coordination of fiscal policy and monetary policy. And so the argument here is to bring central bank much more in towards government decision making. And although I'm not going to say anything about this, to revisit those debates about the coordination of fiscal and monetary policy. So my sort of conclusion in this sort of line of argument in this direction is that the objectives of central banks have to be recast, as they are, I think, in some countries in the process of being carried through. But at the same time, the independence of the central bank has to be amended to ensure that the central bank operations are consistent with government sustainability policies and perhaps other policies as well. Okay. Now, I just here, in a way, repeat a point that I made earlier on, in effect, that there are now well-known issues in inflation targeting regarding the concepts which seem to be fairly central to the decision-making over inflation on potential output and on the natural rate of interest. So, and whether those concepts, which I see as theoretical concepts, do they have any real world counterparts, and the difficulties of calculating what that potential output and the natural rate of interest would be, or what it would take to be. Now, as I indicated before, I think the pandemic has illustrated the difficulties of the concept and measurement of potential output. And these, again, are reinforced in the context of the structural transformations to address climate change. Although I haven't got anywhere with doing this, I think one then therefore has to think again in terms of what would inflation targeting involve? In what sense can rules like Taylor rule have any relevance when potential output and natural rate of interest are, even if they exist, liable to be changing? It seems very difficult to measure. Now, quite a number have argued that the experience of quantitative easing should have been, or could be used to in relation to environmental sustainability. I would want to argue that this is of very limited importance, because quantitative easing is a set of measures whereby the central bank is purchasing the assets from the market to a level settled by government in effect. And the extent to which quantitative easing has happened has gone in spurts, in terms of there were stages back in the early 2010s when extensive quantitative easing, then it flattened off, some degree of reversal, and then a major upward swing during the pandemic. So even if one could use the assets which are being created, which are being bought by under quantitative easing, these vary enormously over time and cannot be relied upon to provide the funding. Now, I think often there's in this area a confusion between using circuitous terminology, that public investment has to be initially financed by central bank through its creation of central bank money. But in general, public investment is not funded by the issue of central bank money. The funding typically comes, if it involves borrowing, then through the issue of bonds. However, under quantitative easing, central banks are clearly buying at stages assets, and the obvious issue arises as to which assets should be purchased by the central bank. Now, there is, I think, there's a number of others have argued, some relatively limited opportunity for the central bank to only consider the purchase of a range of financial assets which are deemed to be green or environmentally friendly. And in that sense, central bank policy should conform to government policies. And I think whilst that may be a laudable aim, so far it hasn't really been in any sense put into practice. Where it has been, but there's been what defines green assets has been set by the central bank, but also some issues of so-called greenwashing have arisen, and doesn't seem to have had any large effect. Now, I think one could say, well, the extent to which the central bank is having some effect here, it is coming from, well, if it is purchasing certain sorts of assets rather than others, then it is to some extent supporting the price of those assets, although those assets already exist and have already funded activities in the past. So there's this rather limited effect which the central bank policies would have, in that it would favour some assets over others, may have some effect upon their price, and maybe relatively limited. So in that sense, I would argue that the quantitative easing side is relatively insignificant. It is something which should be brought in, but insofar as the central bank operates in terms of buying non-government assets, then those should conform to the what are deemed to be green financial assets. And on this quote here, I'll just give one illustration of the extent to which so far central banks have not, though in this case the Bank of England has not conformed to those policies. Now, the area where I think perhaps there should be much more focus is the relationship, or possible relationship, between financial instability and environmental sustainability or the shifts which may take place. Now, there's been quite a literature on this, and in terms of so-called stranded assets, whereby the assets in certain activities, non-renewable energy sources and such like, will become of less value, less profitable in the future, and there may therefore those assets in some sense stranded, and the value of the those assets decline, and insofar as there's equity in those assets, then they will also could well decline in value. So this is a quote. This is from the Financial Stability Board in the UK, indicating that a disorderly transition, there might be emphasis on this term of disorderly, but a transition to a low carbon economy can have a destabilizing effect upon the financial system. And this could be brought about by an abrupt change in either policy or the assessment of risks in terms of the effect upon asset. So, as it says at the end, central estimates of the impact on asset prices are well anticipating transition to a lower economy are relatively contained, although there are many measurement uncertainties. And I think others have in a sense put forward the idea that the valuation of financial assets may be subject to sudden changes, and that really takes the line of argument that the values or the market valuation of let's say brown assets or environmentally unfriendly assets is not being valued correctly at the moment, and that there may be a sudden change in market sentiment which might lead to a sudden change in their valuation. This seems to move away from any notions of efficient markets in terms of the valuation of values, but it is this possibility there will be some sudden changes. And the other, following on from this, what have been called green swan events. This is the echo of what we call black swan events in the context of the financial crisis, and that extreme events which are deemed to be rare in occurrence occur more frequently than anticipated, and so that those if those do occur, that leads to, as it says there, a large set of devalued assets, which may lead in the direction of having to the central banks having to operate as what they call their climate rescues of last resort. And this is a quote from the Bank of International Settlements about the sort of risks which are posed to possibly to the financial system, and in terms of leading to a systemic financial crisis, coming from these. They talk there fundamentally unpredictable environmental and geopolitical dynamics. And this, of course, is always looks at the case where we're trying to translate what is in effect uncertainties, fundamental uncertainties about the future into risk assessment. And we are clearly going to be involved in a situation of very considerable uncertainty, so that the chances of the risk assessment turning out to be incorrect, because the world is just so uncertain, must be very high. And so the chances of some degree of financial crisis following on from this, and how one would react to that. my line of argument here would be, and I'm not going to go into this very much or really at all, is what is the attention really of the of central bank policies. I would argue should be much more in the direction of drawing up policies which are going to avoid a systemic financial crisis without at the same time just bailing out companies which are investing in environmentally unfriendly activities.
Professor Sawyer, if you could wrap it up in a couple of minutes, 4 or 5 minutes maximum.
Yeah, I got the one last one, which is moving in a rather different direction.
Yep.
Which I just want to, and I'll just briefly mention this. Some have argued that, in effect, the central banks should be involved not only in financing, but also funding in environmentally sustainable activities. I want to argue that the activities of the central bank should be confined to issues to do with, on the one side, financial stability, which I just mentioned, and on the other, to do with what assets it buys in part of quantitative easing, and that the major government policies in terms of the funding of environmentally sustainable policy should be public development banks, sometimes called green banks. Various other phrases are being used, and I think in the context of the European Union, one can think of this in terms of this is more the role of the European Investment Bank rather than the role of the European Central Bank. But this is just a quote from Stephanie Griffiths-Jones and others in terms of what is to be the role of development banks. And I think this is the significant part of this is this notion that development banks would have a double mandate. That is, they would need to, in some sense, be commercially viable in terms of revenue meeting costs, but the other, that they should be maximizing sustainable and inclusive development impacts of investment policies. So that the sort of range of activities to which development banks should be putting their funds should be judged by effects upon the environment and so forth, and that they would be the major vehicle for not only public investment, but the support of private investment in environmentally sustainable activities, and should be largely separated from any notion of central bank. Now, I could go into much more, obviously, in terms of the role of development banks and how they fit in with others, but just the only point I want to make here is to separate out the notion of the funding of investment, the responsibility of development banks and others, from the financing, which is the role of central banks. So I think I will conclude on that point, rather than go through my brief concluding remarks. So I'll finish there.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Sawyer. It was enjoyable to go and listen to you after all those years. I'm glad to see that you have developed this particular take-up on the fiscal and monetary policies in relation to sustainable development, because most of the studies have remained rather partial analysis. It seems that there is no question, but if I abuse my position, if I raise this particular question, I'm looking at banks, mainly banks and financial institutions, on sustainable development, but of course the institutional logic of banks are particularly shareholder value maximization, and hence the stakeholder. Of course, there is certain interest, there is an increasing interest, there's a disclosure, but I'm very suspicious. I'm skeptical because of the greenwashing type of understanding. But here we are talking about monetary policy and fiscal policy, which produced by governments, which are supposed to represents the preferences of the larger public? Again, there's a huge question mark. But I feel that the institutional logic of fiscal and monetary policy, central banks, again, is very much around capital and domination of capital and the movement of capital. Do you think, is there a real incentive for fiscal policy and monetary policy, and for that matter, central banks, move in a positive direction towards some environmental impacts, some sustainable development consequences, to develop policies to produce such consequences? I just want to take up your view on that. I mean, considering the institutional logic, at the end of the day, fiscal and monetary policy has the usual institutional logic of capital as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give you much of an answer on that. I think I would. Let me just look at in terms of upper two. Maybe pick up two points, which I think the first is I suppose the nature of the banking system, or the nature of the financial system. And I think, referred to it in terms of about the pursuit of shareholder value. There, I would like, I think, as a number of others, is to promote the use of more stakeholder rather than shareholder value, and the ways of developing financial institutions, which, as to some extent with development banks, have what people have called the double bottom line in terms of and looking at when I've been looking at issues of financialization, I mean, one of the things that has in a way struck me was quite what the at one time the scale of the role of banks and financial institutions, which were sometimes mutually owned by, or particularly mutually owned by their customers. In the UK, we had quite often in the context of house purchase, for example, so that and others have been set up as ethical banks and so on. Those sort of, now, how far we can go with that, I'm not at all sure that what sort of role they have got to play. But I think it's one direction in terms of what one should be developing. The other is whether it's possible to lay down policies which would push, as it were, the banks in the direction that they lend. So what is the role for any sort of requirement that a proportion of any bank's lending is to certain types of activities? In the context of the US, where there's the Community Reinvestment Act, where a certain proportion of funds, as I understand it, have to be invested locally, the development of that sort of policy. I think both of these run up into the difficulty which you've just hinted at, which is, or more than hint, is it actually in the end feasible to define what is it, a green activity or a brown activity? Can we avoid these sort of areas of greenwashing, for example? But also, I'm struck by the complexity of deciding whether an activity is environmentally friendly or not, because once one takes it as that activity may well be part of a complex supply chain. You have to take into account how consumers are going to use that project, but the product from that in the future. So there's so many complexities involved in terms of defining what a green asset, apart from any issues of, well, they no doubt have different degrees of greenness, and indeed there are no doubt all sorts of dimensions of greenness which have to be traded or may have to be traded off against one another. So I haven't gone into this in terms of thinking about this, but I'm just always struck by the complexities of it and how far one can go or eventually go. Whether one just has to say, well, we're going to try push it in that sort of direction, realizing there's going to be quite a lot of greenwashing going on, quite a lot of
yes.
You know, just so it gives a push in that sort of direction.
Okay, but thank you very much. I mean, my fear is that the institutional is happening, but whether public policy in the form of fiscal and monetary policies, similar things is happening, but I guess there is indication for that as well. Thank you very much. I think I wish we had more time to discuss such matters in a more critical manner and institutional manner, but time is an issue. I'm grateful for your contribution to this conference, and I really enjoyed sharing this platform, although virtually, after so many years, to be in the same virtual environment this time. But it was great to see you. Thank you very much for the contribution.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And